The massive chamber of the Galactic Confederation Tribunal stretched before Jack Rodriguez like a cathedral of bureaucratic judgment. Holographic displays flickered with his life's work. Research that had once been celebrated, now twisted into evidence of his supposed scientific heresy. The translucent walls of the central platform seemed to pulse with a cold, institutional light that stripped away any remaining dignity. Dr. Rodriguez, intoned Chairwoman Elena Volkov, her voice a razor-sharp instrument of clinical dismissal. Your theories represent a fundamental threat to established xenobiological protocols. Her fingers danced across a holographic interface, bringing up Jack's most controversial research. Projected images showed complex ecosystem maps, genetic adaptation studies, and theoretical models that challenged everything the Confederation understood about planetary life. Jack stood motionless, his dark eyes reflecting a lifetime of scientific passion, now reduced to a moment of final judgment. His hands, calloused from years of field research, remained perfectly still at his sides. He had known this moment was coming. The inevitable collision between revolutionary thinking and institutional conservatism. Your proposal that planetary ecosystems possess a form of collective intelligence is not just incorrect, continued Volkov, it is dangerous. The potential military and colonization implications of your research could destabilize decades of interstellar exploration protocols. Her words were carefully chosen weapons, designed to strip away not just his professional credentials, but his entire scientific identity. The tribunal chamber was a perfect semicircle of judgment, with representatives from 12 different star systems seated in tiered rows. Each wore the distinctive environmental adaptation suits that marked their species, some humanoid, others so alien that Jack could barely distinguish their individual features. They watched him with a mixture of scientific curiosity and institutional contempt. Jack remembered the moment his research had first begun to unravel. It started with a seemingly mundane study of a Class 5 hostile planet in the Kepler cluster. While other researchers saw only an impossible environment, Jack had detected patterns, complex communication networks that suggested something far more sophisticated than random biological interactions. Your last expedition to the Kepler 452 bits research station resulted in the loss of 3 scientific teams, announced a holographic projection of the Confederation's chief scientific advisor. The man's face was a mask of bureaucratic disapproval. Your unconventional methods and radical interpretations of ecological data put human lives at risk. The truth was far more complex. Jack had discovered something that the traditional scientific community was not prepared to accept, that what appeared to be hostile environments were actually intricate, intelligently balanced ecosystems. His research suggested that planetary life could be understood as a collective, adaptive intelligence far beyond current scientific understanding. The tribunal has reached a decision. Volkov's voice cut through Jack's memories. Your research funding is permanently revoked. Your academic credentials are stripped, and you will be exiled to Tartarus Prime, a planet that has consumed every research and colonization attempt in the last century. A murmur ran through the chamber. Tartarus Prime was more than just a hostile environment. It was a planetary nightmare that had become a byword for impossible survival. Massive predators, constantly shifting geological conditions, atmospheric toxicity that could dissolve most known protective technologies. It was the ultimate death sentence. Jack's mind raced through the implications. Tartarus Prime was a scientific puzzle that had defeated the most advanced research teams in human history. Where others saw a death sentence, he saw an unprecedented opportunity for research. The tribunal believed they were destroying him. In reality, they were giving him exactly what he had always wanted: complete freedom to pursue his most radical scientific theories. A holographic projection materialized beside him, displaying the minimal survival equipment he would be allowed. Basic environmental suit components, a compressed research tablet, emergency medical nanites, and survival rations. It was less a survival kit and more a cruel joke, a token gesture that acknowledged the near impossibility of his survival. Jack Rodriguez, Volkov's final words rang through the chamber. You are hereby exiled from the Galactic Confederation. Your research is discredited. Your theories are rejected. Tartarus Prime will be your final scientific experiment." As the judgment was pronounced, Jack allowed himself the slightest smile. The tribunal had no idea what was about to happen. They thought they were sending him to his death. In reality, they were sending him to the greatest scientific opportunity of his life. The transport would launch in less than 6 hours. Tartarus Prime awaited. The drop pod slammed into the ground of Tartarus Prime with a violence that nearly shattered Jack's bones. Emergency systems screamed warnings in a cacophony of digital distress. Toxic atmosphere warnings, radiation alerts, and structural integrity warnings flashed across his compressed research tablet. The last piece of technology connecting him to any semblance of human civilization. Jack's first breath came with a searing pain that felt like liquid fire filling his lungs. The environmental suit's filtration systems struggled against an atmosphere so corrosive it seemed to eat through molecular bonds. Crystalline formations jutted from the ground like razor-sharp teeth, their surfaces constantly shifting and realigning in patterns that defied conventional geological understanding. Survival statistics scrolled across his helmet display. Estimated survival time, 72 hours. Probability of long-term survival, 0.03%. The numbers were a mathematical death sentence, but Jack Rodriguez had never been one to accept statistical limitations. The landscape defied everything in human scientific records. What appeared to be ground one moment became a churning, almost liquid surface the next. Massive rock formations seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with rhythmic pulses that suggested something far more complex than simple geological processes. In the distance, something that might have been a mountain or a colossal living creature shifted against the toxic amber sky. Jack's first priority was shelter. The research tablet's environmental analysis showed that exposure would kill him within hours. Protective gear meant nothing against the planet's relentless hostility. He began to move, each step a calculated risk. The ground responded to his movement, microfractures spreading like lightning beneath his feet, surfaces realigning with each careful step. 2 hours into his exile, Jack lost half of his equipment. A sudden geological shift, more like a living muscle contraction than a traditional earthquake, sent razor-sharp crystalline formations erupting from the ground. His emergency medical kit disintegrated, nanite containers cracking and spilling their contents into the toxic atmosphere. The compressed research tablet survived, protected by an experimental quantum-locked casing, the only piece of technology that remained functional. Water was the next critical challenge. Surface liquid here wasn't water in any traditional sense. Preliminary scans showed a complex mixture of molecular compounds that seemed to possess a form of primitive consciousness. When Jack attempted to collect a sample, the liquid literally moved away from his collection tube, displaying a level of adaptive behavior that should have been impossible for non-living matter. Night fell quickly, but not in any way Jack expected. The amber sky transformed into a landscape of bioluminescent patterns. Entire geological formations began to glow with intricate, pulsing light systems that seemed to communicate in complex rhythmic patterns. What Jack had initially considered lifeless terrain was revealing itself as something far more sophisticated. Temperature dropped rapidly. Jack's environmental suit began to fail, its protective systems breaking down under the planet's impossible conditions. He was forced to improvise, using fragments of his destroyed equipment and native materials to create makeshift insulation. The crystals that had nearly killed him earlier became his primary survival resource. Their molecular structure provided unexpected thermal regulation. By the end of the first night, Jack had compiled more scientific observations than most research teams gathered in years of study. The planet wasn't just hostile, it was responsive. Every environmental condition seemed part of an intricate, interconnected system that adapted and responded to external stimuli with shocking intelligence. Predators emerged as the toxic dawn broke. They weren't creatures in any traditional sense. Massive shapes moved beneath the surface, their outlines shifting and changing, blending with the geological formations. Jack realized these weren't separate entities. They were extensions of the planetary ecosystem itself. His scientific training kicked in. Where another human would see only threats, Jack began to map out the complex interactions. Each movement, each geological shift, each creature's path seemed part of an elaborate communication network. The entire planet was alive in a way that defied every existing scientific model. Hunger became a critical issue. The research tablet's nutrient synthesizer had failed, leaving Jack with nothing but emergency rations, which would last less than 3 days. He was forced to consider the unthinkable, finding nutrition in an environment that seemed designed to destroy any living thing. As the second day dawned, Jack Rodriguez understood something profound. The Galactic Confederation hadn't sent him to die. They had sent him to the most extraordinary research opportunity in human history. Tartarus Prime wasn't a death world. It was a living puzzle waiting to be understood, and he was going to survive. Not just survive, he was going to unravel its deepest secrets. By the third week of his exile, Jack Rodriguez had become something more than a mere observer. The line between scientific research and survival had blurred into a razor-thin edge of constant adaptation. His compressed research tablet, now a patchwork of native crystalline materials and salvaged human technology, had become an extension of his understanding of Tartarus Prime. The planet's communication network revealed itself in ways that defied every established scientific principle. What initially appeared to be random environmental shifts were actually complex communication patterns. Vibrational frequencies rippled through the ground, through the air, through molecular structures that seemed to breathe and pulse with an intelligence that was neither organic nor mechanical. Jack discovered the first breakthrough quite by accident. During a particularly violent geological shift, he noticed a precise sequence of molecular realignments that matched communication patterns he had previously dismissed as random noise. The crystals around him weren't just geological formations, they were a living communication network. His makeshift laboratory occupied a small cavern formed by crystalline structures that seemed to grow and reshape themselves in response to his presence. Jack had learned to move carefully, to breathe slowly, to become part of the environment rather than an external threat. Each day brought new revelations that would have been dismissed as impossible by his former colleagues. The first successful communication attempt came unexpectedly. Jack had been mapping vibrational frequencies, using fragments of his research equipment to create a crude translation matrix. He discovered that the planet communicated through a complex system of molecular vibrations, electromagnetic pulses, and subtle changes in geological structures. What he witnessed defied comprehension. The ground would shift in response to his research probes. Crystalline formations would realign with mathematical precision when he approached certain areas. Predatory creatures that had previously hunted him would suddenly pause, their movements synchronized with subtle changes in the environmental conditions. Jack's survival now depended on understanding these communication patterns. Food was scarce, and the environment remained lethally hostile. But he had discovered something far more valuable than mere survival. He was learning to speak the language of an entire planetary ecosystem. His notes became a complex web of observations, molecular communication patterns, vibrational frequency maps, geological response matrices. Each day revealed layer upon layer of complexity that human science had never imagined possible. The research tablet, now more crystal than original technology, became a bridge between human understanding and planetary intelligence. Survival techniques emerged from his growing understanding. He learned to predict geological shifts moments before they occurred. Predatory creatures that would have torn him apart now seemed to navigate around him, following communication patterns he was slowly deciphering. The line between research subject and researcher had completely dissolved. Temperature variations became a language. Molecular realignments communicated complex messages. Even the toxic atmosphere carried information, with chemical compositions shifting in response to environmental stimuli in ways that suggested a form of collective intelligence. By the end of the first month, Jack had developed a rudimentary translation matrix. He could anticipate environmental changes, understand basic communication patterns, and move through the landscape with a growing sense of belonging. Tartarus Prime was no longer just a hostile environment. It was a living, communicative system. The most shocking discovery came during what would have been a fable encounter with a massive predatory formation. Instead of attacking, the creature, if it could be called a creature, seemed to study him. Molecular structures shifted, vibrational frequencies changed, and Jack realized he was being assessed, not threatened. He began to document everything: communication patterns, survival techniques, the intricate dance of molecular interactions that governed the planet's ecosystem. His research tablet was no longer just a piece of technology. It had become a living document, partially integrated with the planet's own communication network. The Galactic Confederation had sent him here to die. Instead, Jack Rodriguez was uncovering the most significant scientific discovery in human history. Tartarus Prime wasn't just a planet. It was a living, intelligent system that communicated in ways humanity had never imagined possible. As the toxic sun set on another day of impossible survival, Jack Rodriguez smiled. He was no longer just a scientist. He was becoming something entirely new: a translator, a bridge between human understanding and planetary consciousness. The real research was just beginning. The volcanic canyon stretched before Jack Rodriguez like a living wound in the planet's surface. Massive crystalline formations jutted from the canyon walls, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to breathe with an alien rhythm. He had been tracking a particular set of communication patterns for weeks, slowly piecing together the intricate language of Tartarus Prime's most dangerous predators. They called them shadow claws, though called was too human a term for the complex vibrational signal that represented their existence. Massive creatures that moved beneath the planet's surface, their bodies more like living geological formations than traditional biological entities. Previous research teams had described them as impossible killing machines. Jack was beginning to understand they were something far more complex. His modified research tablet hung from a makeshift harness, now more crystal than original technology. Molecular sensors extended like delicate tendrils, capturing environmental data at a resolution that would have been impossible with standard human equipment. Jack had become as much a part of the environment as the creatures he studied. The first approach was carefully calculated. Jack understood that communication on Tartarus Prime was never simple or direct. It was a complex dance of molecular vibrations, electromagnetic pulses, and subtle environmental shifts. He began to emit a carefully constructed sequence of vibrational patterns, part scientific probe, part careful introduction. The ground began to respond immediately. Crystalline formations around him shifted, realigning in complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with anticipation. The very air became charged with a strange energy, molecular structures vibrating in a rhythm that was both threat and curiosity. Then they came. The first shadow claw emerged from beneath the ground like a living geological event. It wasn't a creature in any traditional sense, more a massive formation of crystalline and organic material that moved with impossible grace. Its body shifted and changed, molecular structures realigning with each movement, blending with the surrounding environment in ways that defied conventional biological understanding. Jack stood perfectly still. Movement was a threat. Stillness was a form of communication. The creature's approach was not an attack, but an investigation. Molecular tendrils extended from its body, scanning Jack with a complexity that made human sensor technology look primitive. He could feel the environmental analysis happening, not just around him, but through him. The shadow claw was reading his molecular composition, his electromagnetic signature, the very essence of his existence. His translation matrix worked overtime, converting the complex vibrational communication into something his human brain could partially comprehend. Threat, curiosity, assessment. The creature was determining whether he was a potential threat, a potential food source, or something entirely new. Jack's breakthrough came in a moment of absolute stillness. He began to emit a carefully constructed molecular signal, part scientific data, part ecological response, part something entirely new. It was a communication that spoke not in words, but in the fundamental language of planetary existence. The Shadowclaw paused. For 3 days, Jack remained in that volcanic canyon. No movement, constant molecular communication. The creature studied him, communicated with him, assessed him. His research tablet captured data that would revolutionize every understanding of planetary life, of communication, of the very definition of intelligence. By the 4th day, something unprecedented happened. The Shadowclaw did not attack. It did not retreat. Instead, it began to move in synchronization with Jack's molecular emissions. What had been a potential threat became something else entirely, a form of ecological communication that humans had never imagined possible. Jack Rodriguez was no longer just a researcher. He was becoming a translator between human understanding and the complex intelligence of Tartarus Prime. The line between observer and observed had completely dissolved. His notes would later describe this moment as the first true communion between human consciousness and planetary intelligence. The Galactic Confederation had sent him here to die. Instead, he was uncovering the most significant scientific discovery in human history. As the toxic sun of Tartarus Prime set, casting impossible colors across the volcanic landscape, Jack Rodriguez understood that he was witnessing something far beyond survival. He was witnessing the fundamental reimagining of what intelligence could be. The Shadowclaws were watching. And for the first time, they were not just watching to destroy. They were watching to understand. 3 years of survival had transformed Jack Rodriguez into something beyond human comprehension. His body bore the marks of Tartarus Prime's relentless environment, a living testament to adaptation that defied every known biological principle. Scars of crystalline growth traced intricate patterns across his skin, molecular structures that were part biological, part something entirely new. The research tablet that had once been a piece of human technology was now a symbiotic extension of both Jack and the planet. Crystalline growths integrated with its circuitry, creating a communication device that was more living organism than machine. Jack no longer simply used the technology. He was part of its fundamental communication network. His physical transformation was only the most visible manifestation of a deeper change. Jack had learned to move through Tartarus Prime, not as an external observer, but as an integrated component of its complex ecosystem. Where humans saw hostile terrain, he perceived an intricate communication network of molecular interactions, vibrational frequencies, and ecological relationships. Survival techniques had become an art form of molecular communication. Jack could predict geological shifts moments before they occurred, navigate through environments that would instantly kill any other human, and communicate with predatory formations that previous research teams had considered mindless killing machines. His body had developed micro-adaptations, subtle molecular changes that allowed him to survive in conditions that defied human physiological limitations. The Shadowclaws, once potential threats, had become something between research subjects and collaborative partners. They moved around him with a precision that suggested a form of communication far beyond simple predator-prey dynamics. Jack had become a bridge between human understanding and the planet's collective intelligence. His daily routine was a complex dance of survival and scientific observation. Molecular analysis replaced traditional nutrition. Environmental communication replaced conventional navigation. Jack Rodriguez was no longer just surviving on Tartarus Prime. He was becoming a living extension of its ecosystem. The changes went beyond physical adaptation. Jack's cognitive processes had fundamentally shifted. He thought in molecular vibrations, in geological timescales, in communication patterns that transcended human language. Traditional scientific methodology seemed laughably primitive compared to the complex intelligence he was experiencing. Biological samples he collected were no longer dead specimens, but living communication networks. Each crystal, each molecular formation, each seemingly random environmental shift carried layers of information that human science had never imagined possible. Jack had become a translator of a language more complex than any human communication system. His body now regulated itself through molecular interactions with the surrounding environment. Toxic atmosphere that would have killed any other human was processed and transformed. Geological radiation that should have been lethal became a form of nutritional input. Jack Rodriguez was no longer just adapting to Tartarus Prime. He was being rewritten by it. The research notes he compiled were incomprehensible to traditional scientific understanding. Molecular communication patterns, ecological intelligence maps, vibrational frequency translations. Each entry revealed a world of intelligence that existed beyond human perception. The Galactic Confederation's most brilliant minds would struggle to comprehend even a fraction of his discoveries. Predatory formations that had once hunted him now moved in synchronization with his molecular emissions. What had begun as a survival mechanism had evolved into a complex form of ecological communication. Jack could guide entire geological formations, redirect predatory movements, and tap into a planetary intelligence that was both terrifyingly alien and remarkably elegant. His transformation was not just physical or cognitive. Jack Rodriguez had become a living bridge between human consciousness and planetary intelligence. The line between researcher and research subject had completely dissolved. He was no longer studying Tartarus Prime. He was part of its fundamental communication network. As the toxic sun of the death world cast its impossible colors across the landscape, Jack understood that he was witnessing something far beyond survival or scientific discovery. He was experiencing a fundamental reimagining of what intelligence could be, what life could be. The Galactic Confederation had sent him here to die. Instead, he was becoming something entirely new, a translator, a bridge, a living testament to the possibility of communication beyond human understanding. Tartarus Prime was no longer just a planet. It was home. The damaged scout ship crashed into Tartarus Prime's surface like a wounded animal, its hull screaming against the planet's impossible geology. Jack Rodriguez felt the impact long before he saw the vessel, a molecular disturbance that rippled through the planetary ecosystem with unprecedented intensity. Conventional rescue protocols would have deemed this a suicide mission. The scout ship's emergency beacon pulsed with a desperation that spoke of critical systems failure. Most would have believed any survivors were already dead, consumed by the planet's legendary hostility. But Jack understood Tartarus Prime in ways no other human could comprehend. He moved through the landscape with a grace that defied human understanding. Molecular structures shifted around him, creating paths where none should exist. The Shadow Claws, those massive predatory formations that had become his closest companions, moved in synchronization, creating a protective corridor towards the crash site. The ship's hull was a torn metal wound against the crystalline landscape. Jack's enhanced perceptive abilities allowed him to analyze the damage before he even approached. Structural integrity at 22%. Life support systems critically compromised. Radiation levels that would kill a normal human within minutes. But Jack was no longer a normal human. As he approached, molecular tendrils extended from his modified research tablet, now more living organism than technology. The device communicated with the ship systems, creating a protective molecular barrier that began to stabilize the most critical environmental conditions. Where a traditional rescue team would see only destruction, Jack perceived a complex communication network waiting to be understood. 4 survivors remained: a human navigation officer, 2 xenobiological researchers, 1 artificial intelligence support system. Their conditions were critical, but not yet beyond salvation. Jack's body had become so integrated with Tartarus Prime's ecosystem that he could manipulate molecular structures to create temporary life support environments. The navigation officer was the first to see him. Her eyes, filtered through a cracked environmental suit, showed a mixture of terror and disbelief. Jack Rodriguez was no longer the scientist they had known. His body bore crystalline growths, molecular adaptations that made him look more like a living extension of the planet than a human being. Communication was no longer about words. Jack emitted a complex series of molecular vibrations that stabilized the ship's most critical systems. Radiation levels dropped. Temperature equalized. The very ground around the crashed vessel began to shift, creating a protective geological formation that would shield the survivors from Tartarus Prime's most hostile environmental conditions. The survivors watched in silent amazement as Jack worked. He was simultaneously healing their wounds, stabilizing their environment, and communicating with the planet in a language that transcended human understanding. What should have been a fatal crash became a moment of unprecedented scientific revelation. The artificial intelligence support system was the first to attempt verbal communication. Dr. Rodriguez, it calculated, your physiological condition defies all known biological parameters. Its processors struggled to comprehend the molecular transformations that had occurred to Jack's body. Jack's response came not in words, but in a series of molecular emissions that the AI could partially translate. Survival, adaptation, communication. The fundamental principles he had discovered on this death world were far more complex than any previous scientific understanding. The xenobiological researchers began to compile initial observations. Jack's body showed signs of complete molecular reconfiguration. Biological systems that should have been destroyed had instead been transformed. His very genetic structure had become a living communication network with the planetary ecosystem. As emergency protocols were initiated, Jack understood the true significance of this moment. The Galactic Confederation had sent him here to die. Instead, he had become something entirely new. A living bridge between human understanding and planetary intelligence. The scout ship would carry back data that would revolutionize every understanding of ecological adaptation, planetary intelligence, and the fundamental nature of life itself. Jack Rodriguez was no longer just a scientist. He was a living testament to the possibilities of survival, adaptation, and communication. Tartarus Prime had not destroyed him. It had transformed him. And now it would transform humanity's understanding of life itself. The Galactic Confederation's primary research complex buzzed with an electricity of scientific anticipation. Jack Rodriguez stood before the assembled panel of the most brilliant minds in human scientific history, his very presence a challenge to everything they understood about planetary ecology, biological adaptation, and the nature of intelligence. Holographic displays surrounded him, each one showing fragments of the data collected from Tartarus Prime, molecular communication patterns, ecological intelligence maps, vibrational frequency translations that suggested something far beyond traditional scientific understanding. The researchers struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his discoveries. Dr. Rodriguez, began Chairwoman Elena Volkov, the same woman who had once sentenced him to death. Your findings challenge every fundamental principle of xenobiological research. Her voice carried a mixture of scientific curiosity and institutional skepticism. The crystalline growths that now partially covered Jack's body pulsed with a subtle, almost living light. The data revealed a planetary ecosystem that was nothing short of revolutionary. Tartarus Prime was not just a hostile environment. It was a living, intelligent system with communication networks more complex than any biological or artificial intelligence humanity had ever encountered. Planets previously considered uninhabitable now presented themselves as potential homes, waiting to be understood. Jack's research demonstrated that what humans perceived as impossible survival conditions were actually sophisticated ecological communication systems. Predatory formations were not mindless killing machines, but integral components of a planetary intelligence that maintained delicate ecological balances. Every molecular interaction told a story of adaptation, communication, and survival. The implications were staggering. Colonization protocols would need complete restructuring. Where humans had once seen hostile environments as obstacles to be conquered, Jack's research suggested a radically different approach. Planetary colonization was no longer about domination, but about communication and ecological integration. His modified research tablet, now a living artifact that was part technology, part biological entity, projected complex three-dimensional models that showed how planetary ecosystems communicated. Vibrational frequencies, molecular interactions, ecological intelligence networks that made human communication technologies look primitive by comparison. The xenobiological research team struggled to process the magnitude of the discovery. Jack had not just survived on a death world. He had become a living translation matrix, a bridge between human consciousness and planetary intelligence. His body bore the physical evidence of a transformation that defied every known biological principle. Planetary colonization models were completely rewritten. Worlds once considered uninhabitable now presented themselves as potential homes. The Kepler cluster, previously thought to be a dead zone of impossible environments, suddenly became a frontier of scientific opportunity. Jack's research suggested that what humans perceived as hostile was actually a complex, communicative system waiting to be understood. The most revolutionary aspect of his research went beyond ecological understanding. Jack had demonstrated that intelligence was not limited to biological or artificial constructs. Planetary systems themselves possessed a form of collective intelligence that was both terrifyingly alien and remarkably elegant. Economic implications followed scientific revelations. Space exploration corporations that had previously written off entire planetary systems now saw new opportunities. Colonization was no longer about technological conquest, but about ecological communication and integration. Jack Rodriguez became more than a scientist. He was a living testament to the possibilities of adaptation, survival, and communication. The Galactic Confederation's most brilliant minds recognized that they were witnessing a fundamental reimagining of what life could be. "We were wrong," Chairwoman Volkov finally admitted, her voice carrying the weight of institutional transformation. Everything we understood about planetary ecosystems, about survival, about intelligence, it was incomplete. The research complex fell silent. Jack's crystalline-enhanced body pulsed with the molecular memories of Tartarus Prime. He was no longer just a human scientist. He was a bridge between worlds, a translator of a language more complex than any human had ever imagined. Humanity's understanding of life itself had been forever changed, and the greatest discoveries were still waiting to be made. 5 years after his return from Tartarus Prime, Jack Rodriguez stood at the edge of human understanding. The crystalline growths that had once been viewed as alien mutations now pulsed with a living intelligence that bridged multiple scientific disciplines. He was no longer just a researcher. He was a living translation matrix between human consciousness and planetary ecosystems. The Galactic Confederation's most ambitious project had begun. Inspired by Jack's discoveries, humanity was approaching planetary exploration with an entirely new paradigm. No longer were worlds classified simply as habitable or uninhabitable. Each planet was now understood as a potential living intelligence, waiting to be communicated with rather than conquered. Jack's body continued to evolve, a constant reminder of the transformation that had begun on Tartarus Prime. Molecular structures shifted beneath his skin, creating intricate patterns that seemed to breathe with their own consciousness. His research tablet, now more living organism than technology, had become a universal communication device that could interface with planetary ecosystems in ways no one had previously imagined. The first wave of ecological translators began their training. Selected from the most adaptable scientists and researchers, they underwent a revolutionary preparation process that Jack had developed. It was less about survival techniques and more about communication, about understanding the fundamental language of planetary intelligence. Worlds once considered dead zones were now revealing themselves as complex, living systems. The Kepler cluster, previously thought to be a graveyard of failed exploration attempts, became a frontier of unprecedented scientific discovery. Each planetary system told a story of intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Jack's original research from Tartarus Prime had become the foundational text for a new scientific discipline: ecological translation, planetary communication, symbiotic exploration. The boundaries between scientific fields began to dissolve, replaced by a more holistic understanding of life itself. The economic implications were staggering. Space exploration corporations that had once focused on resource extraction now invested heavily in communication technologies. Colonization was no longer about conquest, but about dialogue, about understanding, about finding a way to exist in harmony with planetary ecosystems. His lectures at the Interstellar Science Academy drew audiences from across human-controlled space. Jack would stand before massive holographic displays, his body partially transformed, showing how what humans perceived as hostile environments were actually sophisticated communication networks waiting to be understood. Intelligence is not limited to biological constructs, he would explain, molecular patterns shifting beneath his skin. It exists in forms we are only beginning to comprehend. Planetary systems communicate in languages more complex than any spoken words. Our job is not to conquer, but to listen. The survivors from the scout ship that had found him on Tartarus Prime had become his closest colleagues. They had witnessed his transformation firsthand, documented every molecular shift, every breakthrough. What had once been a death sentence had become humanity's most significant scientific discovery. Governments and scientific institutions that had once dismissed his theories now sought his guidance. The Galactic Confederation's exploration protocols were completely rewritten. Planetary approach was no longer about assessment and potential colonization, but about communication and mutual understanding. Jack understood that his transformation was more than personal. He was a living bridge between human consciousness and a broader understanding of intelligence. The crystalline growths that covered portions of his body were not mutations, but adaptations. Communication tools that allowed him to interface with ecological systems in ways no one had previously imagined. The most profound discovery was not about Tartarus Prime or any single planetary system. It was about the nature of intelligence itself. Life was not something that existed, but something that communicated, constantly, dynamically, in languages that transcended human understanding. As the toxic sun of a distant world cast its impossible colors across an alien landscape, Jack Rodriguez smiled. The Galactic Confederation had sent him to die on a death world. Instead, he had discovered something far more significant: a new way of understanding life, a new way of existing, a new way of exploring the universe.